Elinor, resolving to exert herself, though fearing the sound of her own voice, now said, "Is Mrs. Ferrars at Longstaple?" "At Longstaple?" he replied with an air of surprise. No. My mother is in town." "I meant," said Elinor, taking up some work from the table, "I meant to inquire after Mrs. Edward Ferrars." She dared not look up, but her mother and Marianne both turned their eyes on him. He coloured, seemed perplexed, looked doubtingly, and after some hesitation said, "Perhaps you mean, my brother. You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars." "Mrs. Robert Ferrars?" was repeated by Marianne and her mother in an accent of the utmost amazement. Elinor could not speak. Even her eyes were fixed on him with the same impatient wonder. He rose from his seat and walked to the window. "Perhaps you do not know. You may not have heard that my brother is lately married to Miss Lucy Steele." Elinor could sit no longer. She almost ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of joy. His errand at Barton, in fact, was a simple one. It was only to ask Elinor to marry him. How he was received need not be particularly told. This only need be said, that when they all sat down to table at 4 o'clock, about 3 hours after his arrival, he had secured his lady, engaged her mother's consent, and was not only in the rapturous profession of the lover, but in the reality of reason and truth, one of the happiest of men. But Elinor, how are her feelings to be described? From the moment of learning that Lucy was married to another, that Edward was free, to the moment of his justifying the hopes which had so instantly followed, she was everything by turns but tranquil. Edward was now fixed at the cottage for at least a week. For whatever other claims might be made on him, it was impossible that less than a week should be given up to the enjoyment of Elinor's company. Lucy's marriage formed, of course, one of the earliest discussions of the lovers. How they could be thrown together, and by what attraction Robert could be drawn on to marry a girl of whose beauty she had herself heard him speak without any admiration. Edward could only attempt an explanation by supposing that, perhaps at first accidentally meeting, the vanity of the one had been so worked on by the flattery of the other as to lead by degrees to all the rest. How long it had been carrying on between them, however, he was equally at a loss with herself to make out. For at Oxford he had had no means of hearing of her but from herself, and when at last it burst on him in a letter from Lucy, he had been for some time, he believed, half stupefied between the wonder, the horror, and the joy of such a deliverance. "However it may have come about," said Elinor after a pause, "they are certainly married, and your mother has brought on herself a most appropriate punishment. She will hardly be less hurt, I suppose, by Robert's marrying Lucy than she would have been by your marrying her." "She will be more hurt by it, for Robert was always her favourite. She will be more hurt by it, and on the same principle will forgive him much sooner." Edward heard with pleasure of Colonel Brandon's being expected at the cottage, as he really wished not only to be better acquainted with him, but to have an opportunity of convincing him that he no longer resented his giving the living of Delaford. One question after this only remained undecided between them. One difficulty only was to be overcome. They only wanted something to live upon. Edward had £2,000 and Elinor £1, which, with Delaford living, was all that they could call their own. They were neither of them quite enough in love to think that £350 a year would supply them with the comforts of life.